You're live with BBC News. Well, the NATO Secretary-General, Mark Rutte, says he had a frank and open discussion with the US President Donald Trump at the White House earlier in a meeting that lasted over 2 hours. Mr. Rutte made the comments on CNN where he said that President Trump had expressed disappointment with America's allies. Let's have a listen to some of that interview.
So Europe as a platform of power projection for the United States was in full play over the last 6 weeks. And yes, it is true, not all European nations lived up to those commitments, and I totally understand that he is disappointed about it.
On a scale. Well, we haven't heard from President Trump since those talks concluded, but before they began, the White House did say that President Trump believed NATO had been tested and failed during the Iran war. Here's White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
I have a direct quote from the President of the United States on NATO, and I will share it with all of you. They were tested and they failed. And I would add, it's quite sad that NATO turned their backs on the American people over the course of the last 6 weeks when it's the American people who have been funding their defense.
Well, earlier, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, discussed what he called burden shifting within the military alliance during his meeting with Mr. Rutte. Of course, these talks come at a time of heightened tension between the Trump administration and NATO. Just last week, the president threatened again to leave the transatlantic alliance when members, including the UK, refused to join its military offensive against Iran and help the US to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Now, a report from the Wall Street Journal is claiming that the president is now considering punishing some members of the NATO alliance that he believes were unhelpful during the Iran war. Citing administration officials, the Wall Street Journal said the proposal would involve moving US troops out of some of those NATO countries. Well, let's talk about all of the day's developments now. I'm joined live by Daniel Bayer, former US ambassador to the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe from 2013 to 2017. Daniel, thanks for coming into studio. First of all, those remarks from Caroline Leavitt there. NATO was tested and failed. How do you think the conversation went today in the Oval Office?
Well, from Secretary General Rutte's comments, I can tell that he was trying to paper things over, which is what you'd expect. Secretary General Rutte is trying to at least buy time for Europe to shore up its own defenses and try to repair as much as possible the relationship with the president. I think this is not a president who has ever demonstrated a particularly sophisticated understanding of what NATO does and what NATO is for. But NATO is a defensive alliance, and I think many NATO members, while they would be ready to come to the United States defense, and obviously the only time that NATO Article 5 has actually been invoked is in defense of the United States, they were wary of being drawn into a war of choice in Iran, and a war of choice that wasn't going particularly well.
If the Wall Street Journal is indeed representative of what the president is thinking about moving some troops out of NATO member countries in Europe, is that a realistic option? Is that something that the US could do?
It's something that could happen, and it's something that should happen in conversation with European allies, according to the needs of the alliance. It's something that's been talked about for a number of years, whether there might be some drawdown of US troop presence. But for now, the US troop presence isn't just important for the countries in which US troops are stationed, but for the United States. As Secretary General Rutte was saying, Europe is a power projection platform for the United States. It helps keep America safe to have troops stationed in Europe. And I imagine Congress would have quite a lot to say about any sudden moves on that effect, because Congress has shown that it understands the value of having US troops in Europe.
So is this sort of attack on NATO more about the isolated place that the US finds itself now in terms of what's happening in Iran?
Yes, I read the lashing out at NATO as NATO was a proximate target for the lashing out, and the president is deeply frustrated by, as I said, a war of choice, and a war of choice that hasn't gone well, where it looks right now that there's actually a strategic defeat for the United States, despite many tactical successes. The war aims have not been achieved. The war aims that shifted every day have not been achieved, and the Strait of Hormuz is not free and open. It may be open for some period of time, but it looks like the Iranians have discovered that they can now at least shut it down when they want to and charge money for passage, which wasn't the case before.
And while that's happening with the US and its allies, is there something else happening with its adversaries coming together while all this fighting's going on over here?
Absolutely. My friend Tom Wright had a piece in The Atlantic talking about this today, that while the United States seems to be going to great pains to separate itself and cause acrimony with its allies, the adversaries of the United States are actually celebrating this moment and are working more and more closely. We know that China has been an irreplaceable accessory to Russia's war against Ukraine. By the way, the combination of the U.S. With President Trump's attitude towards Europe, his aggressive stance towards Europe, as well as the war in Iran, which drove up gas prices, has been a dream for Putin. He hasn't had to lift a finger, and he's getting tens of billions of dollars or more money, and he's seeing a rift growing between the United States and Europe. He couldn't have designed it better himself. So yes, there seems to be a trend right now where the United States is having fewer and fewer friends, and the United States' adversaries are banding closer and closer together.
And when you mention Ukraine, what does this all mean for Ukraine? I mean, the US is now so heavily focused on Iran, NATO members and European allies trying to still protect Ukraine, and that conflict still raging ever more.
Absolutely. I mean, tragically, one of the biggest losers of this war of choice in Iran has been Ukraine, not only because, as you said, it shifted focus away from Ukraine, which truly is an existential war for Europe. It's an existential war for European security. It's an existential war for the Ukrainian nation, and wasn't a war that anybody in Europe or the United States chose. Obviously, it was a war that was decided in the Kremlin and came from Moscow. Ukraine, which actually does matter significantly for U.S. and European security, and where there is an opportunity to tighten the screws on Putin and to support the Ukrainians on the battlefield. It's distracted us from that. And at the same time, just as Putin was struggling to keep a wartime economy afloat, he's given this free pass, this do not pass go and collect billions and billions of dollars because of the spike in oil prices. And so this has been a real lifeline for Putin, unfortunately. And the Ukrainians will have to continue to fight to defend their freedom for as long as he prosecutes this war.
Daniel Bayer, thank you so much for coming in to talk to us here in studio about
Thanks for having me.
all of how those global conflicts are all interlinked really at this point, aren't they? Thank you.
They are.